All right, so let's start off by talking about the classical model, which we've already looked at consequently, but we're going to look at it here in more detail. Now, the classical model was the first attempt to explain things like the determinants of the price level, national levels of real GDP, employment and unemployment, consumption, as well as savings and investment. So this was really the first attempt to do those things, and it happened early in the 1900s. Now, the classical economists that sort of inspired this model, of course, Adam Smith, the grandfather of economics, a gentleman, an economist called J.B. Say, some others, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Malthus, and A.C. Pigot, and others wrote on topics that built up to this model, ranging from as late as, or as early as the 1770s all the way up until the 1930s. Now, they made some important assumptions. They assumed that wages and prices were very flexible. They could adjust very quickly. And that they also assumed that competitive markets existed throughout the economy, and there weren't sort of any imperfect markets. Everything was competitive, which basically would allow for prices and wages to change, adjust fairly quickly. So they made these assumptions, and as it turns out, they may not be the best assumptions to make. Now, J.B. Say, he came up with this law called Say's Law. And it's basically the idea that supply creates its own demand. So what do we mean by that? It basically means that when an economy or society produces goods and services, it provides that society with the income or the means and the willingness to purchase other goods and services. So in this sense, supply creates its own demand. And hence it follows that desired expenditures will actually equal actual expenditures. But for the most part, you just need to know that Say's law is that supply creates its own demand. So it looks a lot like our circular flow diagram that we've already seen. So basically, again, the idea is that the supply of an output provides the economy and the people within that economy a source of income that they can then use to buy that supply. Okay, so there you go. Supply creates its own demand. Now, the important assumptions of the classical model are that pure competition exists, that wages and prices are very flexible, they can adjust quickly. People are motivated by self-interest. That's not surprising. That's an assumption in pretty much all of the models that we look at. And then this last one is interesting and important. People cannot be fooled by something called money illusion. So don't worry if you don't know what that is. We're going to talk about what that means. All right, so what is money illusion? Money illusion is reacting to changes in prices rather than relative prices. Money prices rather than relative prices. Okay, so to think about what this is, to get an idea for what it means, just think about this, right? So if a worker whose wages doubled when the price level also doubled thinks he or she is better off, that worker is suffering from money illusion. So recall that with money and income, what's really important is not nominal income, but real income. What can your money buy for you? Now, if this worker's wages double, but so does the price of everything else in the economy, they're not any better off. That nominal income that has doubled doesn't buy them more stuff. It buys them the exact same amount of stuff because prices have also doubled. But if this worker acts like he or she is better off, then they're suffering from something called money illusion. It could also be the case, money illusion can crop up in a lot of ways. This isn't the only way. It could be that this worker, a worker's wages don't change, and Well, actually, let me back up. It could be that they feel like they're worse off because they see that prices have doubled, and they kind of ignore the fact that their wage has doubled. That would also be an example of money illusion. Okay, so it can happen in different ways, but that's the idea. Paying attention to money prices, changes in money prices rather than relative or real prices. Now, these classical economists concluded that problems in the macro economy will be temporary and that the market would correct itself as long as the following assumptions held. As long as the government had a minimal role in the economy, didn't try to intervene in any way, as long as there was pure competition prevailing throughout the economy, and that all prices and wages were flexible. In other words, they could change very quickly and easily. And also as long as people were self-interested and didn't experience money illusion. So if these things were true, then classical economists believed that when the economy went into a recession, it could very easily and quickly fix itself and put itself back on the right course. Now, part of the classical model is an equilibrium in the credit market. Now, the credit market is just the market for borrowing and lending money. Now, when companies and individuals borrow money, the source of that money is other people's savings, right? So when income is saved, it's not reflected in product demand, right? People are putting it in the bank rather than spending it on things. So it's not being reflected, that income that's saved is not being reflected in product demand. And in that sense, it's kind of it's a leakage out of the circular flow of income. So we think back to our circular flow of income and production in an economy. If there's some money coming from people's income and it's not being spent on production, things being produced, then that is a kind of leakage out of the circular flow because these savings draw funds away from the income stream. And therefore, total planned consumption can sometimes fall short of total current real GDP. But classical economists argued that every dollar that is saved is matched by a business investment. So every dollar that is saved is ultimately being borrowed and used for investment. And because of this, those leakages actually aren't a big deal. They get injected back into the circular flow. And so when the credit market's in equilibrium, the price of borrowing money, which is the interest rate, ensures that the amount of credit available from savings exactly equals the, let me take a step back, the exact amount of credit demanded for investment, rather, exactly equals the amount supplied coming from people's savings. And we can use our supply and demand model to model the credit market. So we've got planned savings, and this is just the supply of loans. And we've got planned investment, which is the demand for loans. And in equilibrium, we will have an equilibrium level of investment and savings, and it will take place at a particular interest rate, in this case 5% interest, which means that if you were to borrow $100, you would have to pay back $105 the following year. Now, when we equate these levels of savings and investment in the classical model, any changes in these things, a change in savings or a change in investment, can create a surplus or a shortage in the short run, given that interest rate has not yet changed. But over the long run, prices adjust, the price of borrowing money adjusts, interest rates adjust, and so this will eventually be offset by a change in the interest rate. And when the interest rate returns to the equilibrium, supply of money in terms of savings exactly equals the demand for money in terms of investment. Now here's a good question for you to think about. Would unemployment be a problem in the classical model? If you need to, take a minute and think about it if you want. But the answer is no, and it's because, again, classical economists believed that the economy could fix itself. And so if there was a problem in terms of unemployment, things would adjust, wages in particular would adjust to get us back to a point where unemployment isn't really a problem and we experience full employment as an economy. All right, so we can also think about the labor market in the classical model using a supply and demand model. So we've got the supply of labor, right, us, workers, and the demand for labor from businesses. If we were in equilibrium, then there would be no unemployment, at least no cyclical unemployment. But if the wage is too high, we would have a surplus of labor. The quantity supplied of labor would be greater than the quantity demanded, and that difference is called unemployment, right? People that want a job that can't get a job, right? One other thing that's important for us to know is the relationship between employment and real GDP, and there is a direct relationship there. So if there's more people employed, the economy produces more in terms of the value of goods and services, right? So more workers leads to an increase in GDP. So because of everything we've talked about, it turns out that the aggregate supply curve in the classical model is vertical, and the price level in the classical model, long-term unemployment is impossible. Say's law, along with flexible interest rates, prices, and wages, should tend to keep people fully employed, which is, again, why the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. So, again, we've already seen this in the last chapter, in fact. And we saw in the last chapter that if there's a change in aggregate demand, all that happens is that it affects the price level. It has no effect on real GDP. Right, so if we have an increase in aggregate demand, all it does is increase the price level, leading to some inflation, and there's no change in GDP in the long run. Now, it could be in the very, very short run that there's a slight boost in GDP, right? There could be a slight boost in real GDP in the very, very short run, but if prices adjust quickly, we will get back to the long run very quickly, and all that happens is that prices go up and GDP doesn't change. All right, what would be the effect of a decrease in aggregate demand in the classical model? Well, if we begin with the economy at full employment and then aggregate demand decreases, real GDP falls below its long-run level, as represented by the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. As a result of that, unemployment increases, and as unemployment increases, compensation among workers gets pushed down. It pushes wage rates down, and at the same time, other input prices decrease, and the economy again finds itself on the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. So just to go over that graphically, Okay, so starting in long run equilibrium at some price level 1, there's a decrease in aggregate demand, which would lead to some unemployment in the very, very short run, right? So here we have full employment output. Here we have a level of output that's less. And remember that employment and real GDP are directly related. So if we have a decrease in real GDP, we have a decrease in employment. In other words, we have unemployment. And when we have unemployment, that causes pressure for workers' wages to decrease, as well as other prices in the economy. And as those prices decrease, we find ourselves back on the long-run aggregate supply curve, albeit at a lower price level. So some deflation. Okay, so that was the first section looking at the classical model and more in depth. Next, we're going to take a look at the Keynesian model.